The emergency room doors burst open with a deafening bang. "Move, he's losing consciousness." The frantic cry echoed through the brightly lit corridor as nurses rushed toward the incoming stretcher. Rainwater dripped from Jungkook's soaked clothes, forming small puddles beneath the wheels. His face was unnaturally pale, and a thin streak of blood ran from a cut above his eyebrow, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. His eyelids fluttered. The world around him dissolved into fragments of white lights, hurried footsteps and muffled voices that sounded impossibly far away. "Stay with us." Someone squeezed his hand. For one impossible second, Jungkook thought he recognized the warmth. "Don't leave." The whisper escaped his lips before darkness swallowed everything. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air when consciousness slowly returned. A steady monitor beeped beside his bed. His head throbbed with every heartbeat. He blinked several times before noticing someone asleep in the chair next to him, arms folded awkwardly across the edge of the mattress, soft chestnut hair. A cream-colored cardigan draped over the back of the chair. "Jimin." Jungkook frowned weakly. Why was he here? As though sensing movement, Jimin slowly opened his eyes. Relief washed across his face so quickly that he couldn't hide it. "Awake." Jungkook swallowed. "How long?" "Almost 12 hours. 12. You scared everyone." Looked away toward the rain sliding down the hospital window. "I told you not to worry." Jimin gave a quiet laugh. "You were unconscious." Silence settled between them. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the grey afternoon sky. Jungkook finally spoke. "You should have gone home." "I tried. But I couldn't." Jungkook closed his eyes. Nobody had waited beside him like this in years, not after everything that had happened, not after the promises that had disappeared without explanation. He had convinced himself that people always left eventually. Yet Jimin remained there, quietly peeling an orange and placing the slices onto a small plate without saying another word. It was such an ordinary gesture. Somehow it hurt more than grand declarations ever could, because kindness this gentle felt unfamiliar. "You don't even know me," Jungkook murmured. Jimin smiled faintly. "Maybe not." He handed him a slice of orange. "But I know pain when I see it." Jungkook's fingers froze. "You hide it well." "Had practice." Answer was calm, too calm, as though Jimin had spoken from experience instead of imagination. 3 days later, Jungkook left the hospital with only a few bruises and strict instructions to rest. He had no intention of following them. Routine had always been easier than healing. His apartment welcomed him with the same quiet emptiness it always had. The silence was familiar, predictable, safe. He placed his keys on the table. A tiny sunflower keychain swung gently beneath the afternoon light. Without realizing it, he smiled, only for a second. Then the smile disappeared as quickly as it had come. His phone vibrated. A single message. "Jimin, did you eat?" Jungkook stared at the screen. No one had ever asked him that so simply. No hidden expectations, no demands, just concern. He typed a reply, "Not yet." Less than a minute later, another message appeared. "Good. I'm outside." Jungkook blinked. Sighed. He walked toward the window. Below, standing beside a small food truck, Jimin looked up and waved enthusiastically while holding 2 steaming paper bags. Despite himself, Jungkook laughed. It escaped before he could stop it. The sound startled him. He couldn't remember the last time laughter had come so naturally. The aroma of warm soup filled the apartment. Jimin wandered around the kitchen as though he'd visited countless times before, humming softly while arranging bowls on the table. "You really don't have to do this." "I know." "Then why?" "Because you're terrible at taking care of yourself." Jungkook raised an eyebrow. "Known me for a week. In 1 week you've skipped meals, ignored your injuries, slept 4 hours a night and apologized 17 times. You counted." "I notice things." Jungkook looked down. Nobody had noticed things about him for a very long time. The realization made his chest tighten. They ate quietly, comfortably. It was strange. Jungkook had always believed silence between 2 people meant distance. With Jimin, silence somehow felt warm. After dinner, Jimin's attention drifted toward an old upright piano standing near the living room window. "You play?" "Not anymore." "Not." Jungkook hesitated. "My mother loved hearing me play. And she passed away." Room became still. Jimin didn't offer empty sympathy. He simply walked over and rested his fingertips lightly on the dusty piano keys. "You don't have to play for anyone else." He looked back with gentle eyes. "Maybe someday. You can play for yourself." Those words lingered long after the conversation ended. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed almost every day. Sometimes they met at the community library, sometimes at a quiet cafe tucked between narrow streets. Sometimes they simply walked through riverside parks while autumn leaves drifted around them like tiny pieces of gold. Jimin had peculiar habits. He always greeted stray cats before greeting people. He collected pressed flowers inside old books. Whenever he became nervous, he rubbed the sleeve of his cardigan without realizing it. He remembered birthdays after hearing them only once. He believed every broken object deserved one attempt at being repaired before being thrown away. "You fix everything." Jungkook observed one afternoon as Jimin carefully glued the handle back onto a cracked teacup. Jimin smiled. Everything. You keep trying. I have to. Why? For a long moment, Jimin didn't answer. Finally he whispered, because no one tried to fix my family. Jungkook looked at him. Jimin's smile remained, but sadness lingered quietly behind it. My parents divorced when I was little, Jimin said. They were too busy proving who was right to notice what was happening to me. He laughed softly. So I started believing broken things deserved another chance, because people rarely gave each other one. Jungkook listened without interrupting. For the first time he understood that Jimin's kindness wasn't born from an easy life. It had grown from loneliness, from choosing compassion after experiencing pain. That choice made it even more beautiful. One evening they found themselves watching the sunset from a hill overlooking the city. Orange light spilled across endless rooftops. Children laughed somewhere below. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine trees and distant rain. It's beautiful, Jimin whispered. Jungkook nodded. I used to come here years ago, with someone. Yes, the word tasted bitter. I thought we'd spend our whole lives together. Happened, he stopped believing in us. Jungkook wrapped his arms around his knees. I wasn't enough. Jimin immediately shook his head. No, you don't know that. I know people leave for countless reasons. His voice remained gentle, but someone's decision to leave doesn't measure your worth. Stared at the horizon. I still can't believe that. You don't have to today, Jimin smiled softly. Believe it until you can. Something shifted inside Jungkook, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to let a tiny ray of light reach places that had been dark for years. For the first time since his heart had shattered, hope no longer felt impossible. It simply felt fragile, and perhaps, fragile things could still become beautiful if someone chose to protect them together. Morning arrived wrapped in a veil of silver mist, turning the riverside park into a dream painted with soft light. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the distant melody of birds blended with the quiet rhythm of the flowing river. Jungkook stood alone beneath an old maple tree, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. For the first time in years he had left his apartment before sunrise without forcing himself to do so. He was waiting. The realization surprised him. A few weeks ago he had spent every effort avoiding people, convinced that attachment only invited heartbreak. Now he found himself checking the path every few seconds, wondering when a certain warm smile would appear through the morning fog. You came earlier than I expected. Jimin's cheerful voice drifted through the mist. Jungkook turned around. Jimin was carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate, his cheeks slightly flushed from the chilly air. His cream-colored cardigan was hidden beneath a long beige coat, but the familiar sunflower pin still decorated the collar. I thought you might be cold, Jimin said, handing him one of the cups. The warmth seeped into Jungkook's fingers. Thank you. Jimin smiled as though the words themselves were enough to brighten his morning. They began walking along the quiet riverside path without any destination. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their shoes, and every gust of wind scattered golden maple leaves across the pavement like tiny dancing flames. Been smiling more lately, Jimin suddenly said. Jungkook blinked. Have I? You don't notice it. Jungkook lowered his gaze to the steaming drink in his hands. I guess. You look different. Different how? As if you're finally allowing yourself to breathe. Comment lingered in Jungkook's mind long after the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Perhaps Jimin was right. Perhaps the invisible weight on his shoulders had become slightly lighter, not because the past had disappeared, but because someone had quietly begun sharing its burden. Later that afternoon, the library buzzed with unusual excitement. Volunteers hurried between shelves while colourful decorations appeared around the reading hall. What is all this? Jungkook asked. The annual Children's Reading Festival, Jimin replied. There will be over 100 kids here tomorrow. Jungkook looked around nervously. Never been good with children. They're easier than adults. How? They say exactly what they feel. Jungkook laughed softly. I wish adults did that. Jimin's smile faded for a brief second. Sometimes adults are afraid that honesty will make people leave. The words struck closer to home than either of them acknowledged. The next day, the library overflowed with laughter. Children ran between colourful bookshelves wearing paper crowns and animal masks. Storybooks covered every table, while balloons floated gently near the ceiling. Jimin transformed effortlessly into the centre of everyone's attention. He gave every character in the stories a different voice. He made dragons sound clumsy instead of terrifying. He convinced an entire room of children that heroes were people who chose kindness, even when nobody was watching. Jungkook watched from a distance. There was something extraordinary about the way Jimin made every child feel important. As though each smile mattered, as though every small hand reaching toward a book deserved to be held with patience. Near the end of the event, a little girl approached Jungkook while hugging a worn picture book tightly against her chest. Excuse me, He crouched to her height. Yes, are you Jimin's friend? Jungkook hesitated. I think so, she smiled brightly. He talks about you. Jungkook froze. He does. The little girl nodded enthusiastically. He says you pretend to be strong even when you're sad. Before Jungkook could respond, she skipped away to join the other children. His heart skipped a beat. Jimin talked about him, not with judgment, not with pity, but with understanding. That evening after the festival ended, the two of them remained behind to clean the library. Sunlight faded into shades of amber beyond the tall windows. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, Jungkook broke the silence. Why did you keep helping me? Jimin continued stacking books before answering. Do you want the honest reason? Yes, I saw myself in you. Jungkook looked up. When I was younger, Jimin continued quietly, I convinced myself that if I never expected love, I would never be disappointed. He smiled sadly. It didn't work. What changed? I met people who stayed. He looked directly into Jungkook's eyes. They taught me that fear protects your heart for a while. His voice softened. But hope is what allows it to heal. Jungkook couldn't look away. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside, evening rain began tapping gently against the windows. I don't know if I can trust my heart again, Jungkook admitted. You don't have to rush. What if I fail? Jimin stepped closer. Then I'll remind you that healing isn't something you pass or fail. It's something you choose every day. A faint smile appeared on Jungkook's face, small, fragile, real. For the first time in years, he no longer saw tomorrow as another day to survive. Instead, it had quietly become another day he wanted to experience. And without either of them realizing it, the distance between two lonely hearts had grown smaller than the fear that had once kept them apart. The rain arrived without warning. Heavy drops drummed against the library windows, turning the streets outside into shimmering rivers of reflected light. Most of the volunteers hurried home before the storm worsened, but Jungkook remained by the entrance, watching people rush beneath umbrellas. Jimin was nowhere to be seen. For reasons he couldn't explain, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside his chest. He checked his phone, no messages, no missed calls. That wasn't unusual, yet the silence felt different today. As he stepped outside, a familiar elderly woman approached him, struggling to shield herself from the rain with a small umbrella. Jungkook, she called gently. He immediately walked over to help her. Mrs. Han, are you all right? She nodded, though her worried expression suggested otherwise. I saw Jimin leave earlier. Jungkook's heart skipped. Was something wrong? The older woman sighed. He received a phone call. What kind of call? I don't know. She hesitated before continuing, but he looked frightened. Jungkook had never imagined Jimin looking frightened. The man who always smiled, always comforted others, always seemed to know exactly what to say. The image didn't fit. He say where he was going. He only apologized and left. Jungkook thanked her and hurried into the rain. His shoes splashed through shallow puddles as he searched every nearby street they usually visited together. The cafe, the riverside. The small flower shop where Jimin often bought fresh daisies. Nothing. Hours passed. Darkness slowly swallowed the city. Finally, just as Jungkook was about to give up, he noticed a familiar figure sitting alone beneath the roof of an old bus stop. Jimin, his shoulders were slumped. His hands rested motionless in his lap. The usual warmth in his expression had vanished. Jungkook slowed his pace. Been sitting here all this time. Jimin looked up slowly. A faint smile appeared, but it never reached his eyes. I didn't hear my phone. Jungkook sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence instead. After several long minutes, Jimin finally whispered, my father called. Jungkook turned toward him. I haven't heard his voice in almost 6 years. The words were calm, too calm. What did he want? He said he's sick. Jimin laughed softly, though there was no joy in the sound. And suddenly he remembered he has a son. Bitterness caught Jungkook by surprise. He had never heard Jimin speak that way. I don't know what to feel, Jimin admitted. I spent years wishing he'd call. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. That he finally has. He looked toward the rain. I wish he hadn't. Jungkook remained quiet. He understood that some wounds couldn't be comforted with easy words. My father always promised he'd come back. Jimin smiled painfully. Every birthday, every school performance, every Christmas. Always had a reason. Another quiet laugh escaped him. I stopped believing promises a long time ago. Jungkook stared ahead. So did I. The two of them sat in silence again. This time it wasn't empty, it was shared. After a while, Jungkook quietly removed his jacket and draped it over Jimin's shoulders. Get cold, Jimin looked at him in surprise. You always worry about everyone else. Jungkook smiled faintly. I learned from someone. The first time that evening, Jimin's smile became genuine, small, fragile, but real. The following week passed more quietly than usual. Jimin continued volunteering, he continued smiling. But Jungkook noticed the small changes others overlooked. Jimin laughed a little less. He forgot where he placed books. Sometimes he stared out the library window for several minutes without noticing anyone calling his name. He was carrying something heavy, just as Jungkook once had. One afternoon after closing the library, Jungkook found Jimin repairing another cracked teacup. "You don't have to fix everything alone," Jungkook said softly. Jimin stopped what he was doing. "I know, then why do you try?" He smiled tiredly. "Because I'm afraid people will think I'm weak if I don't." Jungkook shook his head. "I don't." Jimin looked at him. "Even a little?" "No." Jungkook took the broken cup from his hands. "You taught me something." "What?" "People don't become weaker when they ask for help." He paused. "They become honest." Jimin lowered his eyes. For a moment, the cheerful mask he wore every day disappeared completely. "I don't know how." "You don't have to know." Jungkook gently placed the cup back on the table. "You only have to let someone stay." A tear rolled silently down Jimin's cheek. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry." Jungkook shook his head. "Apologize for being human." The words lingered between them like a quiet promise. For so long, Jimin had been the one carrying other people's pain without complaint. Now, for the first time, someone was willing to carry a little of his. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Soft evening sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the library windows with warm shades of gold. Jungkook looked at Jimin, whose eyes were still slightly red but no longer empty. Healing, he realized, was never about one person saving another. It was about two wounded hearts choosing, day after day, to walk through the darkness together until they found the light they could not have reached alone.
Autumn slowly surrendered to winter. The trees that had once blazed with crimson and gold now stood bare against a pale sky, their branches stretching upward like silent prayers. Frost coated the sidewalks each morning, sparkling beneath the first rays of sunlight, while the city breathed clouds of white into the cold air. Jungkook had begun to notice something unusual. His apartment no longer felt like a place he simply returned to. It felt lived in. A small potted plant sat beside the kitchen window because Jimin insisted every home deserved something that continued to grow. A stack of borrowed novels rested neatly on the coffee table, each marked with colorful paper tabs where Jimin had written short notes in the margins. "Read this chapter when you need courage. This page reminds me of you. Skip the ending." Jungkook smiled every time he found another note hidden between the pages. For years, he had filled his apartment with silence. Without realizing it, Jimin had filled it with warmth. One Saturday afternoon, they visited the community market together. The streets were crowded with families bundled in scarves and coats. The scent of roasted chestnuts drifted through the crisp air, blending with cinnamon, fresh bread, and hot chocolate from nearby stalls. Children laughed as they chased one another between rows of colorful decorations, while musicians performed cheerful melodies beneath strings of glowing lights. Jimin stopped in front of a tiny booth selling handmade ornaments. "They're beautiful," he whispered. He carefully picked up a small glass star, turning it gently so it caught the afternoon sunlight. "It reminds me of winter nights." Jungkook watched him instead of the ornament. "You always notice beautiful things." Jimin looked at him with quiet curiosity, only because they're easy to miss. Without another word, Jungkook bought the ornament. Jimin frowned. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." "You keep surprising me." Jungkook chuckled. "I learned from someone." Jimin laughed, and the sound blended so naturally with the joyful noise around them that Jungkook wished he could preserve the moment forever. As they continued walking, they passed a small street photographer offering instant portraits. The photographer smiled warmly. "You two look like good friends." Neither of them answered immediately. Instead, they exchanged an awkward glance before laughing at the same time. "Would you like a picture?" the photographer asked. Jimin looked toward Jungkook. "Only if you want one." A few months ago, Jungkook would have refused without hesitation. Photographs reminded him too much of memories that had ended in loss, but today felt different. "Okay," he said quietly. Moments later, they stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the camera. The photographer adjusted the lens a little closer. Jimin hesitated before taking a small step forward. Their sleeves brushed lightly against each other. Jungkook could feel the warmth radiating from Jimin despite the cold winter air. "Smile." The shutter clicked, a simple sound, yet it captured something Jungkook thought he had lost forever, hope. The photograph developed slowly. When the photographer handed it to them, Jungkook stared at it in silence. He looked happy, not the polite smile he wore for strangers, not the forced expression he practiced in mirrors years ago, a genuine smile, one he hadn't realized was possible anymore. "You should keep it," Jimin said. Jungkook shook his head. "No." He carefully placed the photograph into Jimin's hand. "It's ours." Jimin's eyes softened. He slipped the picture into his wallet with extraordinary care. "Treasure it." Simple words settled quietly inside Jungkook's heart. That evening, snowflakes began falling for the first time that winter. Tiny white crystals drifted gently through the dark sky, covering rooftops, trees, and quiet streets in soft layers of white. Jimin stretched out his hand, catching a snowflake before it melted. "Always loved the first snow." "Why?" "My grandmother used to tell me that snow gives the world permission to begin again." Looked around, the familiar city suddenly seemed transformed. Every rooftop looked untouched, every street looked new. As if yesterday's footprints don't matter anymore, Jimin continued. Jungkook lowered his gaze. "I wish hearts worked that way." Jimin turned toward him. "I don't." Jungkook looked surprised. "Scars remind us how far we've come." His smile was gentle. They don't erase happiness. They make us appreciate it. Jungkook stood quietly as snow settled onto his dark hair. For years, he had believed healing meant forgetting. Now he understood something different. Healing meant remembering without breaking. It meant carrying yesterday without allowing it to steal tomorrow. As they walked home beneath the softly falling snow, Jungkook realized he was no longer afraid of silence. Because it wasn't empty anymore. Beside him walked someone who never demanded perfection, never rushed his healing, and never asked him to become someone else. Jimin simply stayed. And sometimes, staying was the purest form of love a wounded heart could ever receive. When they reached Jungkook's apartment building, he paused before opening the door. He looked at Jimin, whose cheeks had turned pink from the cold, snowflakes still resting on his hair. "Thank you," Jungkook said quietly. Jimin tilted his head. "What? For helping me remember that life didn't end with my pain." Jimin smiled with the same warmth that had first reached Jungkook on a rainy evening months ago. "No," he gently shook his head. "You remembered that yourself. I only walked beside you until you could see it again." Jungkook felt his chest tighten, not with grief this time, but with gratitude. For the first time in years, the future no longer frightened him. It felt like a quiet road stretching forward beneath fresh snow, waiting patiently for two hearts that had finally learned that hope was not something found all at once. It was something built, one gentle step at a time. Winter settled over the city with quiet determination, wrapping every rooftop and empty street in layers of white. The world seemed slower, softer, as though even time had decided to whisper instead of shout. For Jungkook, however, peace had always felt temporary. He woke before dawn, unable to shake the unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. The apartment was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall and the gentle hum of the heater. He walked to the kitchen and instinctively reached for 2 mugs before stopping himself. A small smile touched his lips. He had unconsciously prepared one for Jimin. That realization should have embarrassed him. Instead, it warmed him. His phone vibrated. A message from Jimin appeared on the screen. "Good morning. Don't forget to wear your scarf. It's colder today." Jungkook looked at the blue scarf hanging beside the front door. Jimin had knitted it by hand after learning that Jungkook always forgot to dress warmly. Running his fingers across the soft fabric, Jungkook felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt cared for. Later that afternoon, they met at the riverside cafe they had grown to love, the windows fogged with warmth while snow drifted lazily outside. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, blending with the faint scent of vanilla pastries. Jimin stirred his hot chocolate absent-mindedly. "Been quiet today." Jungkook looked up. "Have I? You usually look out the window." "Today you've been staring at your cup." Jungkook laughed softly. "You notice everything. I notice you." The sentence slipped out so naturally that neither of them reacted immediately. Only a few seconds later did Jimin blink in surprise. "I didn't mean to make that sound strange." "Didn't?" Jungkook's heartbeat quickened. It sounded honest. A comfortable silence settled between them once again. Outside, children laughed while building snowmen along the riverbank. Jimin watched them with gentle eyes. "When I was little," he said quietly, "I always thought happiness had to be something extraordinary. What changed? My grandmother." He smiled fondly. "She used to tell me that happiness hides inside ordinary moments." He pointed toward the window, like warm drinks on cold days. He pointed toward an elderly couple sharing one slice of cake, someone remembering your favorite dessert. Then he looked at Jungkook, finding someone who makes silence feel safe. Jungkook lowered his eyes. His heart had begun beating faster again, not with fear, with something far more dangerous, hope. Days later, Jungkook received an unexpected phone call at work. The unfamiliar number made him hesitate before answering. Familiar voice responded. His expression immediately changed. It was someone from his past, someone he had spent years trying to forget. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, Jungkook remained frozen beside his office window, his hand trembling around the phone. Old memories returned all at once, promises, arguments, tears, the painful feeling of not being enough. For the first time in months, panic tightened around his chest. He left work early without telling anyone. Snow fell heavily as he wandered through the city without direction, his thoughts growing louder with every step. Maybe nothing had changed. Maybe healing had only been temporary. Maybe his heart was still just as broken as before. His breathing became uneven. He barely noticed someone calling his name. "Jungkook," he turned. Jimin was running toward him through the falling snow, his scarf fluttering behind him. "Been looking everywhere." Jungkook tried to smile. "I'm okay." Jimin stopped in front of him. "No," his voice remained calm. "Hurting." Jungkook looked away. "My past." He struggled to continue. "It came back today." Jimin didn't ask for details. He simply stepped closer. "You don't have to carry it alone." Jungkook closed his eyes. "I thought I was stronger." "You are. Doesn't feel like it." Jimin shook his head gently. "Being reminded of pain doesn't erase the healing you've already done." The words settled deep inside Jungkook's heart. Healing wasn't a straight path. It never had been. Some days the past walked beside you again. That didn't mean you were walking backward. It only meant you needed a little more kindness. Jimin slowly reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the small photograph they had taken together at the winter market. "Carry this every day." Jungkook looked at the picture. Their smiles looked effortless, real. When I start doubting myself, Jimin admitted, I look at this. Why? Because it reminds me that people can change each other's lives without even realizing it. He looked directly into Jungkook's eyes. You changed mine too. Jungkook felt tears gather for the first time in years. He didn't hide them, he didn't apologize. The tears came quietly, carried away by the cold winter wind. Jimin remained beside him without speaking. Sometimes comfort wasn't found in perfect words. Sometimes it was found in someone choosing not to leave when your heart became heavy again. As the snow continued falling around them, Jungkook realized something profound. He was no longer fighting the darkness alone. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that his pain had disappeared, but that he had finally found someone who believed his heart was worth waiting for, even on the days when he couldn't believe it himself. Spring arrived almost unnoticed. The snow that had blanketed the city for months melted into clear streams that danced along the sidewalks. Bare branches slowly awakened, tiny green buds appearing where winter had once left only silence. The crisp air softened with the scent of fresh blossoms, and birds returned to the parks as if they had never left. Jungkook stood on the balcony of his apartment, watching the sunrise paint the sky with shades of gold and pale pink. Months ago, mornings had felt unbearable. Now they carried quiet anticipation. He reached for his phone before the alarm even rang. A message was already waiting. Good morning. Meet me at the botanical garden at 10. I found something I want to show you, Jimin. Jungkook smiled before he even realized he was smiling. The botanical garden was alive with color. Cherry blossoms floated gently through the breeze, covering the stone pathways with soft pink petals. The fragrance of blooming flowers drifted through the air, mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil after the previous night's rain. Jimin stood beneath an enormous cherry tree, his cream-colored cardigan replacing the heavy winter coat he had worn for months. He waved the moment he spotted Jungkook. You made it, you sounded mysterious. I wanted today to be special. They wandered through winding paths lined with roses, tulips, and lavender. Butterflies fluttered lazily between flowers while children laughed somewhere in the distance. Eventually, Jimin stopped in front of a small greenhouse. Inside stood hundreds of young plants waiting to be replanted. Jungkook looked around curiously. Why did you bring me here? Jimin knelt beside a tray of tiny sunflower seedlings. Do you remember the first gift I ever gave you? Jungkook's fingers instinctively brushed against the sunflower keychain still hanging from his backpack. Carried it every day, Jimin smiled. I noticed. He carefully picked up one of the seedlings. My grandmother believed sunflowers always turn toward the light, even after storms. He looked at Jungkook. Think people can do that too? The words settled quietly between them. Together, they planted the small sunflower in a patch of fresh soil outside the greenhouse. Jungkook gently pressed the earth around its roots. It looks fragile. Jimin nodded. So did we. A long moment, neither of them spoke. The gentle breeze carried cherry blossom petals around them like soft pink snow. I used to think broken hearts stayed broken forever, Jungkook admitted. His voice was barely louder than the wind. I thought surviving was the best I could hope for. He glanced toward the tiny sunflower, but somewhere along the way, a faint smile appeared. I started living again. Jimin looked at him with quiet warmth. You did that. You helped. I only stayed. Slowly shook his head. No, you reminded me that staying is love too. Jimin's eyes shimmered with emotion that afternoon. They walked toward the river, where countless cherry blossom petals floated gently across the water. Children chased bubbles near the shore while musicians played soft acoustic melodies beneath blooming trees. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Jungkook suddenly stopped walking. Jimin noticed immediately. What is it? Jungkook took a slow breath. Been afraid. What? That one day you'll disappear too. Confession hung between them. It was the fear Jungkook had hidden for months, the fear that every beautiful moment eventually came to an end. Jimin stepped closer. I can't promise life will never change. Jungkook lowered his eyes. I know. Can't promise we'll never face difficult days. I know, Jimin smiled gently, but I can promise one thing. Jungkook looked up. When things become difficult, his voice remained calm. I won't run away without telling you. Silence followed, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the promise carried more meaning than either of them could express. Jungkook felt his chest tighten, not with fear, with relief. For so many years, promises had sounded empty. Today, they felt different, not because they guaranteed forever, but because they were spoken with honesty. As evening settled over the city, they returned to the hill overlooking the skyline where they had once watched the autumn sunset together. The seasons had changed, so had they. The same breeze brushed through the trees. The same city lights slowly flickered to life below. Jungkook looked toward the horizon. I used to come here to remember everything I'd lost. He turned toward Jimin. Now I come here to remember everything I've found. Jimin smiled softly. Neither of them needed grand declarations. Neither of them rushed the quiet understanding growing between them. Sometimes love wasn't born in dramatic moments. Sometimes it grew quietly, like the sunflower they had planted that morning, fragile at first, almost invisible, yet reaching patiently toward the light with each passing day. And for the first time in many years, Jungkook no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. Whatever awaited beyond the next sunrise, he knew one simple truth: hope had returned to his heart. And this time, he was no longer afraid to let it stay.